I thought I would follow up on my video from last time about salt and the metabolic consequences of cutting salt too much by actually highlighting a couple studies. I realize I didn't do that before, and I never really want you to take my word for it because that's what gets us into dietary trouble in the first place, right? So there are a couple studies that I would highlight. This first one was published in 1991, so a number of years ago, and the title, Potential Deleterious Impact of Dietary Salt Restriction on Cardiovascular Risk Factors. And I highlighted right here what I thought was the key or very relevant takeaway. What they found was that the very low salt diet in these individuals, and this was a direct intervention, so it's a clinical study, it lowered blood pressure a little. It literally lowered it by 1 point, 1 millimeter mercury point. And so what I like about this is that the authors were honest enough to disclose this and even challenge the meaningfulness of the findings. It's one thing for something to be statistically significant, which is what a scientist is obsessed with, of course, myself included, but it's another for the difference to actually be meaningful. And so the authors note this problem, and they say the net cardiovascular risk benefit of an average blood pressure reduction of only 1.1 millimeter mercury could well be more than offset by the rises in cholesterol, insulin, norepinephrine, and hematocrit, because that resulted from the salt restriction. So in other words, they had a 1 millimeter mercury of drop in blood pressure, which anyone would say is irrelevant, but that was countered, if there is any benefit, to an increase in norepinephrine, which increases heart rate. That's kind of like adrenaline, and an increase in cholesterol levels, which may be good or bad, to be frank, a lot of unknowns there, but typical clinical thinking would say it's bad, and by an elevation in insulin, which by every metric isn't going to be ideal. Now, there was one other study that I wanted to show you. This was published in the journal Metabolism, which is a very, very good journal. It was published in 2001, and the title of it, as you see, Low Salt Diet Increases Insulin Resistance in Healthy Subjects. And what they did was put subjects onto low salt and a normal salt diet for 1 week. And after this 1 week, they'd measured insulin sensitivity with the HOMA score, the HOMA score, which is this balance of glucose and insulin levels. So they figured out the HOMA score at the beginning of the intervention and the HOMA score again at the end of the intervention. And there was a very significant reduction in insulin sensitivity over the course of this just 1 week of salt restriction. In other words, the salt restriction itself explicitly made the insulin resistance worse. It caused insulin resistance. And that's very likely a consequence of the previous study's findings, which is that insulin is elevated. And elevated insulin is one of the primary causes of insulin resistance. So now you have a couple studies that you can kind of chew on a little bit to go along with the dialogue from my previous video. But again, the gist of it all is that the low salt advice that we've been given over the years might in fact, far from be helping solve the problem with heart disease, could in fact be making things worse, not only with heart disease, but type 2 diabetes and all the other complications that come from insulin resistance.